Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about AFK Arena and trying our first video game deconstruction. So hopefully this turns out well. We're going to be experimenting here with kind of the format and how we're doing this, but please bear with us. Hopefully this works out and we'll be steadily increasing in time. But AFK Arena pretty much hit the scene pretty hard from December of last year, and it's been steadily increasing in popularity and performance. The game is what I would call a systems-based RPG in that, it really kind of fundamentally lacks a lot of real RPG-based gameplay, but instead focus more on progression, collections, and RPG systems advancement. Now, I wanted to first kind of start with looking at the performance of the game. And so for that, we use a tool called Sensor Tower. And what we can do is we can do app analysis, and just looking at the app, I can pull up the data with respect to the downloads and revenue. And so here we can see that we'll just choose all time, that the game from a downloads perspective has been pretty good since December. It's kind of spiked, although it's starting to come down a bit. And revenue-wise, the game continues to do pretty well. The full month here is not completed, but there's been a pretty significant revenue ramp from December, kind of spiking in March. But the current amount of downloads looks like it's sitting at about 2.1 million in downloads. With actually that's just the App Store. Let's look at unified, which means both App Store and Google Play. So here we can see that overall downloads is about 8.7 million, and total revenue is 40 million. Remember, this is 40 million net, meaning that this is 40 million after the platform fees from Google and Apple. And if we were to look at some of the top countries, we can see that a bulk of the revenue for AFK Arena is being generated from the US, Germany, and France, with other countries making up a smaller percentage of the revenue for this game. And the one other thing I wanted to pull and to show was, in my opinion, I believe that AFK Arena, let's see, was really modeled after Idle Heroes. And you can see that when we look at RP, which is average revenue per install, that on iOS and Google Play, that it's been showing significant increases over time. And so this is actually this means that they're live operating this game really well when you see continuous improvements in terms of the RP and their KPIs. But AFK Arena also, without as much history, does seem to be improving fairly steadily as well, with the limited amount of data that we're looking at. And we can also, just comparing the two head-to-head, iOS versus iOS, we can see that here, AFK Arena does seem to, at least from a time-based perspective, it seems to have overtaken by a little bit the performance of Idle Heroes from a time perspective. And it seems to be in line with Google Play performance. So at least right now, we're seeing that the performance should be mirroring that of Idle Heroes. And I don't know if Adam or Jeff, you guys have any comments on that. But if not, I also want to talk about the developer, Lilith. Lilith is a fantastic developer. I first found out about Lilith when they made their game Dota Legends. And it was actually, I started work at this company called FunPlus, and I was in Beijing, and a friend of mine at that time, the very first day I joined FunPlus, kind of showed me all of the top games, like literally 30 games in China. And then when I saw Dota Legends, I was just blown away. I went and spoke to the CEO of FunPlus at the time, and we wound up doing a publisher deal for Dota Legends for Southeast Asia. I couldn't convince him to take it to the US, but I was definitely lobbying very strongly to take Dota Legends to the US before Heroes Charge. And we'll also even try to do a deal with Warner Brothers to do a Hobbit version of that game before Heroes Charge hit the market. But anyway, I just wanted to highlight a few things that I thought were kind of unusual or interesting to know about Lilith as a studio. And, first is that the CEO, when I spoke to him, it was through translation. The CEO of FunPlus was translating for us, but I could tell that he was extremely smart and that he had really fundamentally sound sort of principles for how he was running his company. And the first point was like when they were working on Dota Legends, which is, you know, essentially the foundation for games like Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes and Marvel Strike Force in terms of the gameplay and systems and things of that nature. But you know, I like that they really like to focus on key risks. And so for them, they were the most concerned about the specific gameplay for Dota Legends. And so they just spent the first 4 months just 100% focused on the gameplay and nothing else. And they just really wanted to make sure that that gameplay felt really fun and was very natural. The second thing is that, you know, they were all gamers. After lunch, they would all play Dota together. And this reminded me a lot of the stories about early Blizzard and Condor or Blizzard North and how they spent a lot of time playing games together at that studio. And finally, although they didn't force crunch or overtime, you saw a lot of people working a lot of overtime hours and over the weekends. And the one thing about how they did that though was I thought was unusual, which was that if you worked Saturday or if you worked Sunday, you actually got paid for those days. And so there's like this incentive to actually put in the extra hours or commitment to make sure that projects gets done. And so with that, you know, I think we could start digging into the game design, starting with Adam.
Sure. Yeah. So hi, my name's Adam. Yep, I work at Warner Brothers doing product management. Actually moved to the console side just recently, but that doesn't stop my continued interest in the CCRPG market on mobile. But yeah, with AFK Arena, the way that I see it in terms of its positioning is that it's a CCRPG at its absolute core that takes elements of idle to actually drive its engagement. Its actual systems really reflect 99% of what a CCRPG is, but there are actually some nice elements from the idle genre that make it feel slightly what I would call more mobile-y, which personally I really like. Just for myself anyways, after playing a ton of really too many games that are absolutely demanding hundreds and hundreds of hours of gameplay in order to actually make some meaningful progress, I'm definitely looking at you, Warframe. This is very refreshing. So it is a very kind of like light CCRPG that doesn't demand too much of your actual time and can actually be played very, very effectively while in a meeting that you're very too much bored during. But yeah, I've done a lot of deconstructions on CCRPGs, like just too many really to count. With many of them feeling actually very, very similar. They all follow very much the same formula in terms of their modes, in terms of how they kind of drive collection. And this formula, I would say, is a very, very well-worn path. The core loop of this genre, of course, is very, very simple, but the progression of characters, of modes, of the economy is incredibly complex, where it's only getting more and more complicated the more games that come out within this genre. But I think that when we take a step back and kind of evaluate any CCRPG game, we have to kind of evaluate it against its collection and its upgrades system. Really, everything around this game needs to be built around how to make sure that the players have a strong, deep path for collecting and for upgrading every single character into the game, as well as all the systems in the game are actually putting pressure on the player to have the most upgraded as well as the widest collection. And I think personally, whenever I've been analyzing the CCRPGs, the part that I'm most interested in is how they are kind of incentivizing having the widest collection, as in having the most number of things, making sure that each time that I actually use the gacha, whatever drops from it is actually seen as beneficial. And that can be in the form of, say, duplicates, but also in the form of making sure that every character, every drop is something useful to my progression. As well as, say, the actual design of those characters, making sure that every character has a limited utility. That is to say that every single character is actually useful in specific modes to make sure that not one character is a generalist that's amazing at everything. And that's always a very difficult problem that every CCRPG faces. But anyways, that's my obsession. In the context of actually comparing AFK to other CCRPGs, I've kind of picked out 3 key points that I paid attention to when playing the game, because I feel like AFK has actually done some very, very clever things under the hood to make it feel very different from other CCRPGs while still reinforcing what I believe is actually driving like a successful CCRPG, that system pressure on those collections. So the first key point that I want to talk about, and JK's pulled up the image there in terms of the mode. If you go in the game, actually, you can just go to the Dark Forest. It's the second tab on the bottom. Yeah. This basically highlights all the different modes in the game, and I think this is kind of one of my first stops when I'm starting to evaluate, you know, the system pressure in the game, all the different modes that the game offer, how do they each function, how are they paced, and what are they kind of driving at for the player, like how which characters are most useful, what types of team setups are most useful in each mode. So there's 7 core modes, as you can see here. There's actually a couple more as well on if you include the campaign. So the first one is on the campaign. So if you go back to that tab, the first top half of the screen here, where you see 632 at the top, and where JK's notifications are coming down. This is the campaign, the main progression of the game. So similar to like a saga progression, you'd actually be moving up the map, beating levels, which is amazing. But the difference between, say, Galaxy of Heroes is you can't go back and replay some of those old levels. There's no purpose to doing that. Instead, what most CCRPGs would do is say, you know, put some gear sets there and incentivizing going back to specific levels and grinding them. AFK completely ignores that and just says, look, just focus on progressing as quickly as you can through these levels, which is a very, very compelling mechanic, as well as it just kind of drives that sense of progression, but then pushes you to other modes that when you can't beat that top level, you're going to have to play those other modes. The second key mode here is the auto battler, which is at the bottom of the screen here. So where all of his little dudes are running around and doing lots of damage and having nice little things to say. And I would just call this the appointment mechanic. It's a nice sprinkle from idle, where there's an auto battler, there's something happening at all times. So even when you're playing, or even when you're not playing, you're still kind of playing. But this is really kind of a nice retention driver, because every time you collect from that chest, you're getting all those rewards that they've collected. But of course, there's a maximum that chest can ever hold on to, kind of driving that retention, as well as giving some clear reason for a push notification that's compelling. So that's good. But then if we go back to the Dark Forest, to the actual mode screen, this is then where the game gets, you know, significantly more deep. Those first 2 modes are unlocked pretty quickly, and then these next modes are unlocked a little bit more subsequently as the player progresses. So the first one is Peaks of Time, which is at the top right there. This actually unlocks a little bit later in progression, but think of this like a secondary progression mode, so a secondary campaign. So each one of these players can basically play through a little map where they're exploring, trying to defeat as many of the enemies and collect as many of the rewards within it. As the player completes these, they can unlock further ones and then continue along in the story. This is essentially a secondary progression track. On the 4th mode is the Labyrinth, which I think is probably the most compelling mode in this entire game. Number 1, because it scratches my itch of roguelikes, where this is very much like my favorite game currently, Slay the Spire, where you get this idea of each time you're moving forward, you're making a choice between what reward you want to take. After you've finished this battle, after you've completed the RPG battle component, you then get to choose or eventually unlock things like artifacts, which give you relics, which actually give you boosts to your event. So while you're within it, so you want to try to push yourself as far as you can within this 2-day event. But every time that one of your characters dies, they're out of that event. So while you can still use them in other modes, they're out of this event. So this ends up being, say, similar to like Arena and Contest of Champions, or Galactic Quest, I think it was, and Galaxy of Heroes, where it's kind of like a survival event, like just try to go as far as you can. And what's nice is that this is actually unlocked very, very early in the progression, and it's very, very compelling. It's just automated, constantly running every single 2 days. So a lot more aggressive than what I've seen before. So I think this is probably one of the best modes and one of the best ones for driving that collection. It gives you a good use of having as many characters leveled up as possible. 5th mode, King's Tower. which again is another kind of progression mode where you're trying to work your way up these towers by defeating more and more difficult opponents as you progress. Sixth mode would be the Arena PvP mode. So very similar, again, to things like Galaxy of Heroes, as well as things like Heroes Charge, where you're basically trying to work your way up a ladder. What's interesting is that this mode is the only one that's actually paced with energy. So similar to Fire Emblem, similar to all these other CCRPGs, this one's actually paced with energy. And lastly, the mode is Bounty Board, which is the one at the bottom here. And this is what I would call the backbench mode, which is essentially you can dispatch your worst heroes on these little missions. In this mode, it doesn't really incentivize having a high level, I don't think, but it actually incentivizes you to have a collection. So typically, you're trying to send out your worst heroes here. You're typically not going to be using in those other quests to actually gain those rewards. So that's kind of the main mode breakdown, if you think about those 7 modes. And what I find interesting, as I kind of talk through, is just how different it is versus, say, some CCRPGs. Biggest thing for me, say 3 straight progression modes with no pacing involved. So that's the campaign mode, Peaks of Tower, and the King's Tower. Sorry, Peaks of Time and the King's Tower. Each mode doesn't have energy. Each of them only pace based on the difficulty of the level that you're currently on. So eventually, you're going to get pushed away from them as soon as you start not progressing fast enough. Your characters aren't strong enough. So what they do is they actually unlock them slowly after each other. So as you slow down in campaign, you unlock King's Tower. As you slow down in King's Tower, you unlock Peaks of Time, which gives that really, really nice intro progression, which is a nice big booster, while at the same time, giving you feeling like you're constantly unlocking new modes, constantly exploring new things. And the second thing that I want to talk about is just how the economy is set up across these modes. There really isn't, say, a unique incentive to actually play each mode. So if you think about the actual economy for this game and where the actual sources and sinks come from each kind of key currency, what's interesting is that the mode's actual outputs, sometimes they'll give things like store currency, sometimes they'll give things like gotcha currency, but typically modes are split into 2 different things. Either they're rewarding key elements which are driving your gear chase, which is the small gear items that are on each character, or they're giving you basically character chase items, so items that are improving your character. But overall, there isn't really a unique incentive to play each mode. Versus if I look at something like Galaxy of Heroes, I'm going to constantly use that as an example. They actually have like multiple progression tracks within a character. So they have abilities, they have gear, they have level, and each one of these progression tracks is kind of assigned to a mode. So in the case of events, the image that JK has here on the left, right, like the actual purpose of this mode is you have to do it because in order to upgrade all of your abilities on your character, this is where you get that currency. This is the only place you can get it. So all of a sudden in this game, you get a lot less of, say, a unique incentive on each mode versus most of the CCRPGs. So that was my first ramble, my first point on AFK and what I found interesting. The second point was really about driving collection. As I mentioned before, kind of my obsession when I look at CCRPGs. So looking at kind of the ways that AFK incentivizes like a wide character roster. And I talked about a little bit about the key events or the key modes in the game. So you have the Arcane Labyrinth and the Bounty Board being really the only 2 modes that say explicitly kind of push a heavy collection. But one interesting thing is that at launch anyways, it's that they didn't really have a limited time event mode. So similar to what you see here on the left from Galaxy of Heroes, it would be a mode where essentially, right, like you have constantly cycling events on different size timers that are giving unique rewards that are needed to basically progress specific characters. And what this does is incentivizes specific, say, factions of characters. So in the case, there would be an event for Jedis, and then you want to bring out all your top level Jedis, compete there. So it gives a nice collection incentive. So in the case of AFK, there is no mode for this. You can't see that on the map. But actually, since launch, they launched a new mode called Dura's Trial. I actually didn't get to play this, unfortunately, because it's a limited time event. But this is where they're starting to experiment with it. So it is good to see them, like, since launch, kind of continually adding new modes and finding new ways to incentivize that wider collection. But I've always been kind of curious about, like, how they got away with essentially not having that limited time event mode kind of driving that collection. And I think that actually has to do a lot with the team composition system that they have. So if you pull that up, where it kind of shows the bonuses that you get for having a different team composition. So in the case of here, one of the interesting things that they did with their design is that there's factions in the game. I think there's 6 different factions, and they all have, say, like a rock, paper, scissors-ish type of element. Cool. But the way that they incentivize team makeup is, instead of saying, you know, try to have one of each one in your team makeup, say similar to like Pokemon, where you're trying to, you know, don't have like a whole team of water Pokemon, because then you'll get destroyed by electric. In this case, they actually do the opposite. They say, look, you need to have all of the same faction within your team to get the best bonuses towards your attack and defense. So this kind of like promotes a very flat team structure, which is very different than what I've felt in CCRPGs. So what ends up happening is that in the end game, when you're trying to design your team, you end up needing to build essentially a team of 5 top-level heroes for every single faction. So there's 6 factions. So you really need roughly 30 heroes, 1 for each faction, so you can drive it. So you can basically play at the top level. And what ends up happening is, in things like PvPs, instead of it being, say, very, very tactical about how what your team setups actually are, it's much more about countering the enemies that you're facing. So you're trying to, it's much more a bit more PvE, that aspect, where you're trying to just counter what's given to you rather than, say, build a defensive strategy around your team. So yeah, that was interesting to me, because I felt like that was very different versus most CCRPGs. And the last point that I'll talk about is their merchandising. So I've talked a lot about battle passes, etc. in the past. I think they're very, very interesting, especially for me now in console. And one of the more interesting aspects for me in AFK was actually their implementation of a battle pass-like component. So this would be the system called advancement rewards. So they actually have a couple different systems here. The one interesting one is advancement rewards, which basically says, look, if you pay us in the very beginning of the game with a time limit, then you're going to be gaining crazy high rewards each time you make major story progression marks. So in the case of the advancement rewards, what you're seeing, say, sorry, with JK, your account, you missed your opportunity. You didn't get it. You got to buy that in early. You got to be smart. But in the beginning, you can actually take that retention trade-off. You say, well, do I think I'm going to stick with this game? Am I going to play through chapter 1? Am I going to play through chapter 3 all the way to the end? And it was a very, very nice kind of trade-off for retention. On top of that, they have a system called Regal Rewards, which is very much a battle pass, where essentially there's the free track, where as you play the game, you're earning, say, the battle pass's form of XP. And you can see here on the left, you've got your free track, which is blue crystals. That gives you rare heroes, which are actually not that useful to you by the mid game, versus the right track, which is purple crystals and diamonds, which of course is premium currency, and purple crystals, which is for epic heroes, which are far more useful in the end game. So very, very similar to a battle pass component. And what's interesting, of course, is that, like, versus most battle pass implementations, when you think about Fortnite, you think about PUBG Mobile, these games are much more cosmetics driven. This game in particular, of course, is very economy driven. So they don't really have to give a ton of unique rewards and a crazy unique cosmetic at the end of it. Each one of these rewards is very, very useful in their economy. So this is a strong driver regardless. So those were kind of the 3 big notable points that I made. I would just say my takeaway from AFK, its design and kind of its resulting success. It's essentially that, like, product-focused innovation is actually quite a lot to be competitive in this market, in this very, very mature market. Like when I play this game, like, the art style is meh. The core fighting is pretty forgettable. But the progression systems are incredibly deep. The social components are tied progression early. Team composition actually retains enough strategy. Their marketing tactics are actually pretty cunning. They actually advertise this game not even as a CCRPG. They advertise it as an idle game. And the merchandising, as I talked here with the battle pass, is actually some of the best in class. So they've actually focused their innovations, I would say, more on the product side. And they actually won based on those differentiating factors, not on factors that, say, an altruistic game designer such as myself would love to win on, things like art style or core gameplay depth, or team composition, like super strategy. Like that's not how they won.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I didn't know you were an altruistic game designer.
I'm Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I constantly switch between those two things. So yeah, as that game designer inside me weeps, my evil product manager side says, I told you so.
Yeah.
Focus matters in this mature marketplace, and this game actually shows that you can drive success by focusing on, say, merchandising,
right,
product, instead of, say, smart innovations, and right, as well as keeping smart innovations in design. So that was my takeaway. I'll hand it off to you, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, just as a game designer, this may make you weep, and as a product guy, it makes you happy. As a economy and systems guy, this makes me really happy.
Good.
Just as I've played probably just as many other CCRPGs as you have, and one of the ones that struck me 2 years ago was Idle Heroes, and looking what they were doing is so different from the other RPGs out here. And for me, like, what I've really appreciated from AFK Arena is that it's taking Idle Heroes, but really like streamlining a lot of it, making things clearer for players, and just the pacing of the game is perfect. Like, my number one complaint for a lot of RPGs is that in the Elder game, the time it takes to do everything the game is asking you to do, it explodes. You could easily, like Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes, you may easily spend hour and a half each day and still not necessarily do everything the game's telling you to do. AFK Arena, it's really, really easy to kind of be an Elder player and get everything you need to done. But some things that I'm going to tackle today is mainly a greater look at the depth of the economy, particularly when it comes to heroes, as well as how they smartly are using stat checks in multiple parts of the game to really drive investment in hero upgrades. So you go to, first, if you want to go to the Temple of Ascension, Joseph, in Ranhorn.
Yes.
So the rarity system, which is pretty similar to Idle Heroes, that it's similar in function. They though simplify it a lot, I feel like, for players. Basically, you have a specific pathway to upgrade any hero to Ascended. It's a mixture of requiring the same hero at a certain rarity level, as well as other faction heroes. And this is what AFK Arena and Idle Heroes does so well, because anything you get from gacha that is rare or elite will eventually be used to upgrade heroes that you want to a certain ascension tier. You're never really getting a bad draw. You may not be able to use that fodder for a while until you get the hero you want to upgrade, until you have everything you need to upgrade to the next rarity. But you'll never want to just get rid of it. It'll eventually become of use. Versus a game like Galaxy of Heroes, where if you want to upgrade a specific hero, you are really at the mercy of their gacha system. Both based on what hero you're going to get, as well as how many hero shards you're going to get. AFK does not have this problem. They I don't want to say clearly, because you do have to dig kind of deep into it, but they really like give you a straight pathway to upgrade the hero you want to the ascended rarity. And so by that means, unlike Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes, or probably the better comparison is Legendary, where heroes get outdated very quickly, and in order to maintain your monetization, Legendary has to create new events that both introduce new heroes and repurpose or revitalize old heroes through event bonuses and stuff like that. AFK doesn't need to do that, because all the heroes that you get are going to ultimately be used to get other heroes to the rarity that you want. And they even have taken that and made it a step better. If you, the total max level you can get to is based on the number of heroes you get to ascended. I think it's 5 per every ascended hero you have outside of your first 5. As you can see, like ascended brings the max level to 240, but then every hero besides your initial 5 that are on the crystal or the resonating crystal, every hero above 5 that you bring to ascended level, rarity level, it will increase that cap by 5 levels. So at the time that this was taken, I don't know when it was taken, there were 34 heroes that could be brought to the ascended tier, so that would increase the max level from 240 to 410. But in this case, if they added a 35th one, then potentially a player could get their heroes to level 415. It's really just a super smart system. So their live ops, I would imagine all their live ops, they're really just going to be putting pressure for players to just engage more with existing systems. Right now in the game, at least in my game, they're having a event about PvP using their not the basic arena, but the grand tournament where you have to make 3 teams of 5, and there's extra incentives to do that. At this game, the stage of the game, they're doing pretty well monetization wise. It's all about keeping players engaged and keeping them retained, and they're doing just fine from what I've seen. But I want to go and go back to this notion of the different gameplays and how they all essentially are just various forms of stat checks. Like Adam mentioned, there's no stage grinding like you see in Galaxy of Heroes. There's no redoing of something that you've done. Once you beat a campaign level or get a reward from Peaks of Time, like you are essentially done with that, and you don't need to do it again. So the game is essentially a series of stat checks, and the different gameplay modes really use stat checks differently. Campaign and the King's Tower basically is just a 5v5. Like, here's the 5 opponents, use a mixture of your team bonuses and the RPS to get around this 5 enemy challenge. Arcane Labyrinth, as Adam talked about, is a really just well thought out version of doing the survival events that you see in Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes and other RPGs. And what's smart about this is they add in strategic decisions both in the relics that you choose after battle and whether to do more battles and forego, the healing, the new heroes, and the gear purchases. There's a lot more strategic choice, but it never cannibalizes the need for higher stats and a wider array of heroes that are upgraded. So it's both more fulfilling for players, but not at the cost of monetization, which is fantastic. And the pacing is just perfect. Like having to do an arcane labyrinth every 2 days, which at most maybe takes 20 minutes, 20, 30 minutes, versus like Galaxy of Heroes and other RPGs, their survival events, they will expect you to go through it not just once each day, but I forget the max you could do today, whether it's 2 or 3 or whatnot. That's just a lot of time to be spent on just one system in a game. And the pacing in AFK Arena is just perfect. But what I find really interesting is the Peaks of Time event, because it's kind of takes a sort of combination of the Arcane Labyrinth and the campaign. Arcane Labyrinth is a just a core core content. You know, it's not limited time and doesn't change, but you still have the same sort of survival rules that you have in the Arcane Labyrinth, where you could do all your heroes once, but once they get damaged or once they die, they stay that way until you reset the content. But what they do is, whereas the pathways of Arcane Labyrinth is pretty linear. Yeah, you get to choose different tiles, but you're heading essentially straight towards the boss. The Peaks of Time maps are a lot more open-ended. Players do get to choose which direction they go, but the design of the maps really sort of like kind of push them to go a specific routes. And whereas in Arcane Labyrinth you are fighting enemies that are easier to harder always, Peaks of Time uses both map design and artificial story rules to force players to fight harder enemies before some easier enemies. In the case of the third Peaks of Time map, I think it's called Secrets of the Forest or whatever, there's, to get the final rewards in that map, you need to both fight a pretty strong boss early on, but also defeat the boss with a team of 5 wilder heroes. So whereas Joseph, I had the screenshots of that. If you want to take a look at the encounter in the Secrets of the Forest. Yes. So here, to get to the final rewards, you need to beat this boss with 5 wilder heroes. Now, in Arcane Labyrinth, when you see a team of 5 of one faction, you're definitely incentivized to use the opposing faction, but you're not required. If you have a strong group of 5 heroes of various factions, you could go ahead and use that in the Arcane Labyrinth and not be penalized. But in this case, in the Peaks of Time, you have to use 5 wilder heroes in order to get that final thing that will let you get the reward. So it is an artificial means of requiring the player to use a specific army composition. And I'm only on the 5th Peaks of Time scenario. I could see there's at least, I think, close to 2 dozen, if not more, and it's something that's easy to add over time. You can. This is a pretty easy way to add content that will continue to add new stat checks, but also use map design and story to get players to go face enemies in a certain order. And if you notice, Adam was right in that almost all the different gameplay systems in the game reward more or less the same thing, just a little different. Peaks of Time are one of the only systems that I've seen so far that will reward artifacts. So they're using the system that they probably have the most, the strongest ability to stat check players in specific ways to reward some of the most compelling things. It's a really smart system that I haven't seen in any other RPG, even Idle Heroes, and I'm personally excited to see how else they utilize Peaks of Time to engage and challenge players. But that's pretty much my biggest takeaways for right now. Again, I really do want to stress the quality of life improvements of AFK Arena versus not only Idle Heroes but other RPGs. Yes, there's a lot of stuff to do, but the time required really isn't that much between what the daily challenges and weekly challenges require. It's super easy to get everything done without having to spend a ton of time, and you still get the same fulfillment that you would with any other RPG. I'm just a huge fan, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they do next.
Great. And so, I mean, I can wrap up by just kind of talking about a couple of points that I thought were interesting. And first is around the core design philosophy and basically their product strategy approach. And so what it seems like, from my eye, it sounded like, and Jeff, you had referenced Idle Heroes as well, but my take on this is they looked at the success of Idle Heroes and kind of used what I call the peak strategy. And so what does that mean? So peak games is kind of known for like taking an existing category of games. They'll go in, they'll read all the comments about, in terms of reviews and feedback, and then they'll try and make the game a little bit better. You can also call it the Blizzard approach, right? Taking an existing genre and then trying to improve that game. And that's essentially what it seems like. You can see the influences from Idle Heroes. You can also see the influences from some of the other games that they've developed, like Rise of Kingdoms, for example, and taking like the best of those other games and integrating it here. And so it seems like what they've done is they've seen that there's a market need, or that there's a number of players that are looking for this kind of casual RPG progression experience. So that's why they have this kind of focus in terms of the messaging around, AFK or idle, or you can progress without spending too much time or involvement. And so to me, this is really like trying to cater towards like an RPG slots audience, right? It's like you're kind of mindlessly going through the systems and stuff like that. And so I feel like that's the opportunity that they pursued. And I feel that they did a pretty good job there and, really cater to that audience. If I'm being honest, I kind of don't like this kind of game personally, but because it is all systems based, but I can see how it was very successful. And then speaking to like the second thing for me that I liked was in terms of their UI UX. And so, just looking at the game, you can see that one thing that they did differently from Idle Heroes, and you can see that if I can just pop up the Idle Heroes. So this is a screen for Idle Heroes. And you can see this is landscape mode. They've got a pretty big menu. You have to scroll left and right to see everything on the screen. And this seems very cluttered. There's just all this stuff on the screen. And so I think one of the big advantages of AFK Arena is that, one, they shifted the orientation to a portrait mode. It is a little bit more simple. You can see a lot of the UI elements, just basically creating like a visual menu-based system, but they've simplified it to some degree from Idle Heroes. And there's certainly like a lot of UI UX influences from the original Dota Legends game. The other thing I like is that what they've done is they have actually integrated a lot of badging and notifications to incentivize you to go in and look at all these different menus. And so, I don't have the badge here, but in terms of gift sets, they try to incentivize you to go to these by providing they embed free gifts that refresh every once in a while, so that you kind of come here and you're kind of incentivized to go into the store and look at these different screens, very similar to what Clash Royale has done in terms of their store. And a lot of these things that where you're incentivized to go in and just click through and tap into a lot of these different areas. Besides that, I also think that compared to Idle Heroes, they added a lot more visual progression in terms of the main home screen. So here you can see that there's a lot of treasure that I need to collect. So I'll collect that treasure. And that shows, in Idle Heroes, like this idle component was kind of put off into the PvE section of Idle Heroes, and for them to bring that into the home screen, I think was a very good improvement, as well as Adam had mentioned, bringing this kind of mini saga map so that you can see, oh, I'm making this, this is the progress that I'm making. And so when you come in, you're able to have that visual progression to see the progress you're making, in addition to, like, you know, being able to see your power and your level and things like that. But yeah, for me, that's basically the key takeaways that that I had. You know, in addition to a lot of the systems and event design and, you know, merchandising and collection aspects that Adam and Jeff spoke about. But I don't know, guys. So Idle Heroes versus AFK, I personally think it's a pretty big improvement. But what do you guys think? How do you guys think AFK Arena stacks up against Idle Heroes in the future?
AFK is a far better position. I think Jeff really hit on it in terms of their live ops and just like how much effort it needs to actually maintain and like drive deeper and deeper economies. And their game is set up to scale far better.
Right.
Yeah, they've definitely taken a lot of care to make sure that the time required doesn't spiral out of control. Even like things like the bounty, like when you first start out, you have to manually assign the heroes, but at some point, either when you get to a high enough bounty level, or maybe it's a VIP thing. I don't know when it happened, but like for me, I'm now able to just push a button that auto dispatches. So it's a button that'll autofill the bounty. Just much more easy to clear the board, the bounty board, than it would be just if they always had to manually assign each one. Just a very, like, the guild boss, the first time you defeat him, but all the other subsequent guild bosses you fight that day, you could just do an autocomplete. PvP, you could push a button and autocomplete. They really have taken care to make sure that players who generally, you know, enjoy doing all this stuff and all the different senses of progression, that you're not forced to sit through a lot of assignment and exactly. So I think really well done. Definitely a step up from Idle Heroes, and I think it will. I would imagine it would retain a lot better than Idle Heroes, given how much care has been taken to make sure that the player experience is a lot better. But I guess time will tell.
Great. All right. Well, I think that is basically it for us. So the first sort of video deconstruction that we're trying. And so for those in the audience, if you've got any comments, please put them, please comment and let us know what you think. And with that, I think we're basically done. Thanks, Adam and Jeff.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. It was a great time.